So our second group of eukaryotic microbes are the protists, and this is the subject of section 5.5. So we're going to look at the different types of protozoan and the means of locomotion that they use, and that's going to be the main focus of this section, and that's how we classify them. So the protists are, traditionally they have been combined into the kingdom Protista, but now there's a couple of subkingdoms called algae and protozoa. And well, this is the traditional way. They would put them into these subkingdoms of the algae, which are plant-like, and subkingdom protozoa, which are animal-like. But now they're in supergroups. There's like 6 supergroups that are bigger than a kingdom, and like the algae are now combined with the same supergroup as plants, and the protozoa are in the same supergroup as some of the animals. And so we just talk about this as a group of organisms, and it's not a kingdom, but they are any eukaryotic, unicellular, or colonial organism that lacks true tissues. So they don't have tissue. So algae are the photosynthetic, the plant-like organisms that are protists. They are single cell, but they can also be in filamentous, or they can be in colonial kind of organization, but they're not true tissues. They don't have true tissues. So seaweed and kelp are really pretty macroscopic, actually. And so it's hard to believe that those aren't considered plants, but those are actually a type of algae. And they're kind of colonial is the best term we can use for that. And they exhibit all kinds of eukaryotic organelles. They contain chloroplast, which has green chlorophyll, the pigment chlorophyll. Other pigments will create yellow, red, brown colorization. And so that coloration is one of the ways that we identify the different types of algae. So the phyla, or divisions of algae, have been developed as a result of their coloration. So algae are in fresh and marine water. We call them phytoplankton because they're like plants. Phyto is kind of plant-like, or you can just call it plankton. And they float around. They have a really essential role of in the aquatic food web. They're the producers. They produce most of the Earth's oxygen and the sugars because of the photosynthesis that they do. And primary medical threat from algae, there really aren't. This is why we don't study algae so much in micro for this class, because you're not going to be microbiologists necessarily. This is for people going into nursing and other health sciences. But the primary medical threat from this group is the red tide algae, the ingestion of toxins that are produced during the red tide. And so there's pictures of that. You can just go Google red tide on the web, and there's some really cool pictures of the red tide, and it really looks like blood in the water. So that's very common in like Florida, the Middle East, some of these inland kind of marine or freshwater environments, but I think the red tide's more marine. So the biology, there's about 65,000 species. Most of them are harmless. There are a few species of protozoan, though, that are parasites, and they're responsible for hundreds of millions of infections of humans every year. So it's a very small number of the protozoa, and so we're going to talk about the groups of protozoa. So protozoa form and function single cells. They are single cellular always. They don't form colonial organisms. They don't form filaments or anything. They are always single cell organelles, or organisms that have eukaryotic organelles except chloroplasts. So they don't have chloroplasts. They do have specialized structures that will be similar to a mouth. They'll have lysosomes that act as a digestive system, and they have little gullets that go from the mouth to organelles that will have digestive enzymes in them. And reproductive tracts and legs, means of locomotion, not really legs, but they have means of locomotion. And so that's primarily how we separate the different groups of the protozoans, is by their means of locomotion, how they move around. So their nutritional habitat and range, they are heterotrophs because they don't have chloroplasts, they don't do photosynthesis. They are other feeders. They require food in complex organic form. So they're free-living and parasitic. So the free-living species live off of, they kind of scavenge dead animals and plants, and they graze off of live cells of bacteria and algae. And the parasitic species live on fluids of the host, such as plasma and digestive juices. Many actively feed on tissues. So there's some nasty little ones in this that are parasitic, and they're the most interesting to us. So the different styles of locomotion, they have pseudopods, which are like the false feet, amoeboid motion, and flagella that vary in number from one to several, and cilia that can be over the entire surface. So like we said, cilia are only found in protozoans. They are not found in animals, certain animal tissues, like I said, but they're not found in bacteria, they're not found in algae, they're really only found in cilia. So pseudopods, amoeboid motion, and flagella, that's that long tail, longer structure that can have kind of a propulsing motion, and the cilia that are distributed over the whole entire surface. And again, the cilia are more for feeding, but they can also move toward their source of food, and that's how they get their food. So here you can see a flagella in this organism, and you can see the amoeboid structure. The amoeba here has a food vacuole, a nucleus, and a water expelling vacuole, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so they can engulf their food with these pseudopods, these extensions. When they find something they're interested in, they stream in one direction. Their cytoskeleton and all their organelles and the plasma all stream in one organism in one direction, and then they can engulf it. And they take it in and form a food vacuole, which then fuses with a lysosome to make a phagolysosome, which breaks down the food to be digested and used by the cell. So when they fill up with too much water, if they're a freshwater amoeba, and other protozoans can have these, they have a contractile vacuole, which will expel excess water. So it takes up the water and then it expels it when it gets too full. Cilia, like we said with the stentor, they can make kind of like a tornado type suction to funnel the food down into the food vacuoles. And then this is another type. So this is a ciliophoran. They have cilia. This is an example of a flagella, an organism with a flagella called a mastigophoran. And the sarcodyna, which are the ones that have these fleshy, fleshy feet, that's what they call them. Sarcodyna are like the amoeba. And then the apicomplexan, they are going to produce spores, and that's how they reproduce and spread themselves also. And this would be like a toxoplasma would be an example of this one, or the one that causes malaria. And so these are ones that you would have looked at in lab 3. So there are 2 stages. The trophozoite's the feeding stage, and that's the active stage. It has to have food and moisture to remain active. But when there's lack of food or lack of moisture, they can go into this dormant stage, cyst stage, kind of like the endospore. It becomes dormant, and then when the conditions become favorable again, then they can break open and then start feeding again. But it's just whenever the environment is unfavorable for growth and feeding that they're formed, and they are an important factor in spread because they can be in the water, you can breathe it in, you can take it in through food or water, and then it opens up inside your body and starts the active feeding stage, the trophozoite stage. So here's the trophozoite, it's actively feeding, and then they dry up and they become the cyst, and then when they get taken in and there's enough moisture and food, then they break open and the trophozoite is reactivated. So it's not really a method of reproduction here. This is just the life cycle and what happens when they get into an unfavorable environment, how they can survive. So reproduction in this can be simple, like they can just do a binary fission, they can just split, or it could be very complex. And so some will only exist as a trophozoite, some will alternate back and forth between trophozoite and cyst, and then their life cycle will dictate how they're transmitted. Simple asexual methods like mitosis, some use fission, like binary fission, and some use sexual reproduction as well. So conjugation can be possible where they exchange genetic material between two cells, so there would be a connection between the two cells. And you might have seen this with like spirogyra, doing long strands of the spirogyra, and then they exchange genetic material between the two cells. But that's really more of an algae thing. But conjugation can happen as well between protozoans. So classification typically is the method of movement. And so those that use flagella, those that use amoeboid movement, and then those that use cilia, and those that have no motility, they call those sporozoa because they produce spores, and that's how they spread themselves. The cilia, I will say, they're usually, they use like a transverse fission, sort of like binary fission, they just split. And they are typically fresh or free living and harmless. There are very few, there's maybe like one or two, but very few of the ciliopherans, the one that have cilia, are actually going to be very dangerous and pathogenic. The most pathogenic ones are the ones with the flagella or the amoeboid movement, and the ones that don't have motility. The sporozoans always are parasitic. The entire group is parasitic. So identification, again, you're looking at the method of locomotion generally. To get down to more specific, they're going to look at the size and the shape of the cell, the type, number, and distribution of the locomotor structures, the organelles or cysts, the number of nuclei, and all of these can be sampled with from the body, like blood, sputum, cerebrospinal fluid, fecal, vaginal samples. They can be put on a slide and stained, or with or without staining can be viewed. So some of the more dangerous ones, the amoeba, Naegleria is another one that can cause a brain infection, and it comes in water. So we've seen some situations where it comes in water parks and in freshwater lakes, and it goes to the brain, and it could be very silent for a while, and then it can cause damage, and it's just degenerative, and over time it's just kind of a silent killer. But amoeba are typically from food and water, and they cause a gastrointestinal type thing. Balantidium coli, that's one of the rare ciliopherans that cause disease, and that's more in pig and cattle that we can get them from them as well. Then flagellated ones, these are ones that we actually looked at, except for the leishmania, but we'll talk about leishmania in a disease section. Giardia lamblia is found in water, and it causes a pretty bad diarrhea. Trichomonas vaginalis is in humans, and it's a reproductive tract symptoms. So it's a sexually transmitted infection, which is pretty rare. You don't see a lot of parasites that cause the disease that are sexually transmitted. Usually it's food or water. Transmission of, and then trypanosoma brucei or cruzi, that's sleeping sickness, African sleeping sickness, or Chagas disease. Those are ones that can cause central nervous system issues. Leishmania, leishmaniasis causes some skin lesions, but they can also go into the internal organisms. And both of these are animal vector borne, so there's like some insects or flea, or think the Chagas disease is the kissing bug, and there's a fly, the tsetse fly, that transmits I think the trypanosoma. Leishmania is carried on. There's the sand fly, and so those are vector-borne. We get bit by them, and then it's transmitted that way. The Plasmodium, this is what causes malaria. That's also a mosquito vector. Toxoplasma is, you get this from cats in their feces, and so it has a flu-like symptoms, but can be very deadly to babies if it crosses the placenta in the womb. And this is one of the ones that we talked about in lab, that your cats can give it to the pregnant mothers, and it can pass the placenta to go to the babies, and it can cause really some irreparable damage to the development of the brain. It just kind of depends on when you get it, but that's why you're not supposed to change the cat litter box, or you should just pretty much get rid of the cat while you're pregnant. See if someone else can take care of it while you're pregnant. Cryptosporidium can cause cryptosporidosis, which that's very common. Well, not very common, but there was probably the biggest parasitic outbreak in water was caused by Cryptosporidium little cysts that got through the water system, the water treatment system. And this happened in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the early 90s. And like 400,000 people got it. And I think 200 people died from this infection. They were mostly people who were immunocompromised. Some of them had HIV, and they just couldn't fight off the infection. Cyclospora, this is something that's also in fresh produce and water. So these are all non-modal, so they're the ones that are what we call the apicomplexan or sporozoa. And the flagellated are in the group that we call the mastigophorans. The amoeboid are the sarcodyna, and then the ciliophorans are the ones with cilia. So concept check 5.5, true or false, algae don't cause any type of human disease. Well, anytime you say any type, don't cause any type, that's like none. That's usually false, and it is false. So they do have the red tide, the toxin that's produced by the red tide can cause disease in humans. The 3 styles of protozoan locomotion, so we've just reviewed those. Those are the no motion, there's actually 4. No motion, the sporozoa, the cilia, the flagella, and the pseudopods. And so the different groups are based on the type of locomotion. True or false, all protozoa have a trophozoite form, but not all produce cysts. And that is true. Some have just the trophozoite and they don't produce cysts, some do both. The term blank is often used to describe protozoan and helminth pathogens. So the word parasite. So when you study parasitology, you are looking at protozoans and helminths. So they have a win-lose situation. So the host is losing and the parasite wins in that relationship. And that is the end of section 5.